Left, right, center. You hear these labels thrown around all the time, right? But honestly, trying to make sense of them can feel like you're navigating a total maze. So today, we're going to find a clear map to figure out what these terms are actually all about.
So, when you hear someone call themselves left-wing or right-wing or a centrist, what are they really telling you? Are these just jerseys for different political teams, or is there something deeper going on? Well, let's break it all down.
Here's the game plan. First, we'll get a handle on what political ideology even is. Then we'll dive into that classic left-right spectrum. After that, we'll explore a really key tension: sticking to your ideology versus just doing what works. We'll see how this plays out with a real-world case study on the Nordic model. And we'll wrap up by asking what makes any system work in the first place.
Okay, first things first. Before we can make sense of any of the labels, we have to understand the big idea they're all built on: political ideology itself. The best way to think about an ideology is like a mental map. Yeah, it's a whole framework of ideas and values that tries to answer the biggest questions a society has. Like, how should we all live together? What's fair? Who gets to be in charge? And how do we split up all the stuff? It's basically the blueprint for building a society.
So, with that idea of a map in our heads, let's turn to the one you see everywhere: the left-right spectrum. We're going to look at what's going on at the far ends and what's happening right there in the middle.
When you look at the extremes, you see two completely different worlds. On the far left, which has its roots in Marxist ideas, the #1 goal is total economic equality. This means the state runs the economy, and the whole idea of private property, well, it pretty much goes away. On the other hand, the far right is all about protecting a national identity and keeping social order. Here, private property is sacred, but the state can be really protectionist and authoritarian to enforce its vision of order.
So what about the center? It's not just some bland middle ground. It's an active balancing act. Centrists generally love a free market economy, but, and this is a big but, they believe the state has to step in with regulations to keep things fair. The whole philosophy is built on moderation, slow and steady reform instead of radical revolution, and a huge emphasis on democracy and talking things out.
But hang on, here's a really important twist. It's not just about where a government lands on that map, it's about how it governs. And this brings us to a huge clash of styles, following a strict ideology versus being pragmatic.
You can really see two different ways of thinking here. An ideological approach is guided by a fixed set of rules and values. That's great for consistency, but the big danger is that you become so rigid you totally lose touch with what's actually happening. A pragmatic approach, on the other hand, is guided by a much simpler question: what works? It's super flexible and focused on results. The risk there? Well, you might look like you have no core beliefs at all. The truth is, most governments try to mix a little of both.
Okay, let's see how all this theory actually plays out in the real world. For that, we're going to look at one of the most talked about systems on the planet, the Nordic model.
Right, so the Nordic countries are so interesting because they just don't fit into a neat little box. People love to call them socialists, but they're also home to some of the most competitive, freewheeling capitalist economies in the world. So what gives? What's their secret? Well, it isn't one pure ideology. It's a unique hybrid that mashes up a free market with a massive social safety net.
Their system really stands on 5 pillars that all lean on each other. It all starts with Pillar 1, a super competitive capitalist economy that creates a ton of wealth. But that wealth is then used to pay for Pillar 2, a universal welfare state that gives everyone access to things like free education and healthcare. So how do they afford it? That's Pillar 3, high and progressive taxes. And the glue holding this whole thing together, that's Pillars 4 and 5. Really strong, transparent government with very little corruption and a culture of social trust where people buy into the system.
And here's the engine that makes the whole thing run: taxes. And we're talking a lot of taxes. In the Nordic countries, taxes make up a whopping 40 to 45% of their entire economy. That's the deal. It's the trade-off their citizens explicitly make: pay higher taxes and in return get incredibly high-quality public services for everyone.
So is the trade-off worth it? Well, the data is pretty striking. The Nordic countries are always at the top of the list for human development and quality of life. They are consistently ranked among the least corrupt nations on the planet. And get this, their poverty rates are about half the average of other developed countries. By pretty much every metric you can find, this model works.
All right, let's zoom back out. Taking everything we've looked at, from the big ideologies to the Nordic model, what does it all tell us about what actually makes a society successful? I mean, this is the million-dollar question, right? If our goal is to build a society where people can thrive, which path is the one that actually gets you there? Every model comes with its own major trade-off. The Anglo-Saxon model, think the US or the UK, is amazing for innovation and growth, but it often creates huge inequality.
Authoritarian models can deliver crazy fast growth, but it comes at the cost of personal freedom. Radical socialism promises equality on paper, but in practice, it's often led to shortages and low productivity. And the Nordic model, as great as it is, has one huge catch. It runs on a culture of high trust and low corruption that's incredibly hard to build from scratch.
And that brings us to the single biggest takeaway from all of this. It turns out the most successful societies aren't the ones that are ideologically pure. They don't stick rigidly to one playbook, whether it's pure capitalism or pure socialism. Instead, they are relentlessly pragmatic. They figure out a way to create a powerful blend, using the engine of the free market to pay for the safety net of social equality.
Maybe the best way to sum it all up is this. Ideology gives you the vision, the big why for everything you're doing. But it's pragmatism that actually delivers the results, the how that makes people's lives better. So the final question I'll leave you with is this. Where does your own country fall on that scale between vision and results? Thanks for tuning in.